Yes, most people were taught that World War I began with a single gunshot in Sarajevo. Learned the names of archdukes, field marshals and Kaiser Wilhelm II. Were told about trench warfare, gas, and national honor. Yes, but behind every rifle fired on the Western Front, there was a ledger book, an opening in London. In the summer of 1914, the British Empire was the unchallenged titan of global finance. Yes, the City of London was the world's clearinghouse, setting the price of gold and shipping and international credit. The pound sterling was backed by physical gold, was stored deep inside the vaults of the Bank of England. Yes, it was an empire built on the promise that paper money could always be converted into gold at a fixed rate. Yet, within 48 hours of Germany's invasion of Belgium, that centuries-old financial architecture cracked. Cost of modern industrial warfare rapidly bypassed every historical model. Was conflicts, then paid its armies through taxation and modest government bonds. Alas, in August 1914, the British Treasury calculated that the war would cost roughly £300,000 a day. Within months, that daily expenditure skyrocketed to over £5 million a day. Then, by late 1915, Britain was spending £7 million every 24 hours to keep its war machine alive. Tax revenue, even at emergency wars, covered less than 25% of the imperial war budget. Bank of England faced an existential liquidity crisis almost immediately. If gold reserves were allowed to leave London to pay for foreign munitions, the entire financial structure of the empire would collapse. Prevent a massive bank run, as Parliament quietly passed the Currency and Banknotes Act of 1914. This law authorized the Treasury to issue paper banknotes as Treasury notes, without gold backing. Gold standard, where the very bedrock of British global supremacy was quietly suspended in practice. Thus, the public was instructed to hand over their gold sovereigns to support the war effort. And they received paper currency, whose value rested entirely on faith, his victory. Thus, to the citizen on the street, this flag still flew over 5 continents. Now, to the clerks in the Treasury, the account ledgers revealed a terrifying mathematical reality. That Great Britain was running out of money, and far faster than its generals were running out of soldiers. Thus, the war was no longer just a military contest against the German army. It was a race against financial insolvency, as inside the vaults of the Bank of England. The empire needed shells, steel, horses, grain, and oil. As most of these vital war materials could only be purchased from one place, across the Atlantic Ocean. United States of America. By 1915, the Western Front into a bloody stalemate. Millions of men were locked in muddy trenches, stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The British military was consuming artillery shells, a rate never before imagined in human history. At the Battle of the Somme alone, British artillery fired over 1.5 million shells in 7 days. British domestic factories could not keep up with this insatiable demand. The British government turned to American industrial production to supply its armies. American steel mills, plants, and agriculture became the engine room of the Allied war effort. However, purchasing American supplies created a lethal financial bottleneck. American suppliers did not accept British paper currency or imperial promises. Demanded payment in American dollars, or physical gold delivered to New York. At the start of the conflict, the United States was officially neutral under President Woodrow Wilson. As neutrality laws initially restricted American banks from extending massive loans to belligerent European nations. As Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan warned President Wilson that money is the worst of all contrabands, because it commands everything else. As Bryan argued that allowing American banks to loan billions to allied governments that destroy American neutrality and pull the country into the war. For a brief period, Washington banned private bank loans to foreign nations at war. But as British purchasing orders flooded into American factories, a deep economic boom took hold across the United States. American farmers, steel barons, and chemical manufacturers were making unprecedented profits. If Britain stopped buying, the boom would collapse into a devastating American economic depression. Nearly al tinfensian fin, under immense pressure from Wall Street, President Wilson quietly reversed the loan ban. Private American financial institutions were now permitted to extend commercial credits to the British government. To manage this massive purchasing program, British Treasury made a historic agreement. They appointed a single private American banking firm to act as the sole purchasing agent for the British Empire, the United States. That firm was Morgan and Company, at 23 Wall Street. P. Morgan was not just a bank, it was an international financial empire in its own right. Under the leadership of Jack Morgan, the firm assumed total control over Allied purchasing in America. A contract for steel, gunpowder, cotton, and rifles purchased by Britain in North America passed through Morgan's hands. P. Morgan received a commission of 1% on every single dollar spent by the Allies. By 1916, J.P. Morgan and Company was purchasing over $10 million worth of goods every single day for Britain and France. Bank effectively controlled a supply chain that accounted for nearly 20% of total American exports. To pay for these vast supplies, P. Morgan organized massive syndicates of American commercial banks to issue loans to London. The firm floated a $500 million Anglo-French loan to the American market in late 1950. This was the largest foreign loan that ever floated on Wall Street up to that point. To secure these loans, P. Morgan demanded collateral. The British government was forced to mobilize its citizens' private financial holdings. British investors holding American stocks and bonds were compelled by law to hand their securities over to the British Treasury. The American stocks, as bonds, and railway shares were shipped across the Atlantic under heavy naval escort and locked in Wall Street vaults as collateral for British war debt. By mid-1960s, Great Britain, as the world's ultimate creditor nation for over 2 centuries, had become the largest debtor nation in history. As London was paying for its war by mortgaging its global financial assets to a private bank in New York. As the calendar turned toward 1960, that collateral was about to run completely dry. As the British war budget fractured in late 1915, military strategists in London faced another catastrophe on the battlefield. Dardanelles campaign at Gallipoli had collapsed into a disastrous defeat. British, Australian, and New Zealand troops were forced to evacuate, leaving over 40,000 dead behind. The Ottoman Empire, as long mocked as the sick man of Europe, had delivered a humiliating blow to British imperial prestige. Worse still, Ottoman forces were threatening British imperial interests in the Middle East. An Ottoman assault across the Sinai Peninsula came dangerously close to cutting the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was the absolute arterial lifeline of the British Empire. Carried Indian troops, as Australian wheat and Persian oil directly to Europe. As if the Ottoman military locked the canal, maritime routes connecting London to its Asian empire, that would be severed. As desperate to open a second front against the Ottomans from within, this government looked for a regional ally. Found that ally in Mecca. As Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, that was the custodian of Islam's holiest sites. As, although under Ottoman sovereignty, as Sharif Hussein sought to liberate Arab lands from Turkish rule. Between July 1915 and January 1916, and secret letters were exchanged between Hussein and Sir Henry McMahon. McMahon was the British High Commissioner in Cairo, as acting on direct instructions from the British Foreign Office. As Sharif Hussein promised to launch a massive Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. In return, Hussein demanded an explicit British guarantee. Demanded the creation of an independent, unified Arab kingdom, stretching from the Arabian Peninsula to Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. As Sir Henry McMahon's letters were written in deliberately calculated, used diplomatic language. In his famous letter on October 24, 1915, McMahon accepted the Arab boundaries, as with specific exceptions. He excluded certain areas in northern Syria, as where French imperial interests were already established. As, crucially, the territory of Palestine was not explicitly named as an exclusion in the original text. Sharif Hussein, which was crystal clear. If Arab forces shed their blood to tie down Ottoman divisions, then would grant them an independent state, then Palestine. While 1966, believing in British honor, as Sharif Hussein launched the Great Arab Revolt. The fighters, coordinated by British officers like T. Lawrence, derailed Ottoman trains, severed telegraph lines, and pinned down thousands of Turkish troops. The Arab Revolt opened a critical second front, protecting the Suez Canal and clearing the path for British forces to march northward. As the British military had bought military victory in the desert and the promise of Arab independence as currency. However, back in Whitehall, those letters were viewed not as a permanent solemn pledge, but as a temporary, a short-term military contract. A contract that London had every intention of rewriting, the moment a better offer appeared on the imperial balance sheet. While Sir Henry McMahon was writing promises to Sharif Hussein in Cairo, another set of negotiations was taking place in secret, far to the north. 1815, inside a dimly lit room in Downing Street, men sat over a large, blank map of the Middle East. As one was Sir Mark Sykes, an ambitious British aristocratic politician. The other was François-Georges Picot, as a senior French diplomat and staunch imperialist. As their mission was simple, ruthless. As they were tasked with carving up the Ottoman Empire, before the war was even won. As France had invested billions of francs in Ottoman public debt before 1914. As demanded its share of the spoils, specifically Syria, Lebanon, and the rich agricultural lands of Cilicia. Then, meanwhile, Nas wanted to secure its petroleum supply lines from Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. London needed absolute, permanent control over the approaches to the Suez Canal. As for months, Sykes and Picot argued over every river, mountain, and ancient town. 1916, with the approval of Tsarist Russia, the secret Sykes-Picot agreement was officially signed. As Sir Mark Sykes notoriously summarized the deal to the British cabinet, "I should like to draw a line from the E in Acre to the last cænked in Kirkuk." The single stroke of a red pencil. As Sykes drew a straight line across the map of the Middle East. As north of the line, the Blue Zone, as was assigned to direct French control and influence. South of the line, the Red Zone, covering Mesopotamia and Jordan, it was allocated to Britain. As Palestine, however, came a major point of friction between London and Paris. Neither empire wanted the other to hold sole control over the holy sites of Jerusalem or the lands adjacent to the Suez Canal. As a temporary compromise, the Sykes-Picot Agreement designated Palestine as an brown zone, placed under an international administration. The Sykes-Picot map was a pure masterpiece of code, a cynical imperial geography. It completely ignored ethnic divisions, naval boundaries, the sectarian realities, and historic trade routes. And most importantly, stood in direct, reconcilable contradiction to the promises made to Sharif Hussein just months earlier. As to the Arabs, Britain had pledged an independent Arab state, including Palestine. To the French, Britain had pledged to partition that exact same land into European spheres of influence. As the British Foreign Office was now operating a dual-entry ledger of international diplomacy, were issuing duplicate, as conflicting titles of ownership to the exact same piece of land. As at the time, British officials cared little about the contradiction. Audience and sixteens, diplomacy was viewed as an exercise in short-term survival. Promises were assets to be issued during crisis, liquidated or renegotiated during peace talks. As the war dragged into 1970, Britain's financial collapse would force London to issue yet another mortgage on Palestine. A third promise, but to a third party, as that would blow the previous two agreements to pieces. By the spring and summer of 1970, as the financial war had reached a catastrophic breaking point for Great Britain. German Navy had unleashed unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking hundreds of Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic. Supply lines were choked, and the cost of shipping war materials soared. More critically, Britain's credit reserves in the United States were completely exhausted. For nearly 3 years, Britain had been paying for its American supplies by selling off British-owned American stocks and shipping physical gold Thors. By mid-year's ending, the British Treasury had virtually no marketable American securities left to offer as collateral. The gold vaults of the Bank of England were running dangerously thin. June 1977, the British ambassador to Washington, Sir Cecil Spring Rice, sent a disparate, a frantic cable to Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour. He warned that Britain's financial position in New York was on the verge of total collapse. J.P. Morgan and Company informed the British Treasury that it could no longer float unsecured short-term loans on Wall Street. The bank warned that without new collateral or direct intervention by the U.S. government, purchasing orders in America would have to be halted within weeks. As British orders stopped, the supply of shells, steel, and grain to the Western Front would freeze. The Allied war machine would grind to a dead halt, not because of a military defeat in France, but because of a liquidity crisis in Manhattan. In April 1917, the United States had officially declared war on Germany. However, the American military was small, unprepared, and would take over a year to deploy significant troop numbers to Europe. Furthermore, President Woodrow Wilson faced a deeply divided American political landscape. Many American political and financial circles remained highly skeptical of European imperial ambitions. Washington was reluctant to issue unlimited government-backed credit to underwrite British and French imperial debts. Inside the British cabinet, Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour held emergency meetings. They realized that military victory alone would not save Britain if the empire went bankrupt before Germany surrendered. urgently needed an additional lever of power. A way to mobilize political, diplomatic, and financial support inside the United States, Russia, and across the global financial network. As they needed a masterstroke that could align British imperial survival with powerful global interests.